I think that Missing is the perfect representative of what format can do to your film. I've not seen Searching yet, but this is an apparent spiritual sequel as the director of this is an editor in that film, which I didn't know going in. I felt that Johnson took a plot which would otherwise have been a decent but unexceptional thriller and elevated it immensely with this creative and competently executed composition, where almost the entire film takes place through the camera eye, be it a webcam, security camera, or otherwise. Thanks to this meticulously maintained medium, Missing is a far more memorable and intriguing experience, and the other strengths of the movie, such as its unpredictable twists and moments of sublime suspense, are also majorly enhanced by their being implemented through this form, often very cleverly and satisfyingly linking back to things we already have on the computer screen, and in one particularly memorable instance doing so while simultaneously executing the reveal in real life. It's also commendable for its lack of pandering to the audience in how it did these things, assuming a tacit understanding on behalf of the viewer, and that once enough had been revealed, they could fill in the gaps. A good example being how the father, James's bloody nose, was actually thanks to the cocaine, which was never explicitly shown or stated, but is clearly inferred. One of my favourite aspects of this film is how it features a refreshingly realistic depiction of both computer software in general, and especially the internet. There were some weird choices and mistakes, like some of the sound effects being silly or too loud, which I would definitely point out the clicking sounds as an example. And as my dad pointed out to me, at one point a password was visible without the show password box being checked. And there were also some allowances made to maintain the pacing and the hectic high-octane energy that a certain scene is going for, mainly being the extremely fast loading times and response times from things like web searches and software responding instantly with no buffering. However, while noticeable, I didn't find any of these egregious, and none of them really took me out of the moment. I was mostly impressed and relieved in how well things were generally represented here. Too often do I see things like Search.com or Raspberry in other films, and it can be really jarring and feels cheap or ridiculous. Perhaps the best element of this is how they did social media, with a pretty believable showcase of various different platforms and outlets, and how they responded and interacted with events. I particularly liked some of the Easter eggs they threw in, like some of the funny comments in the live chats that felt eerily real, and a Lo-Fi Girl reference at the end. Big up Lo-Fi Girl. The editing was very hyperactive and commendable, and often stole the show completely. While the format was exceptionally important to the film's success and pretty decidedly defined it overall, I didn't find that Missing was completely style over substance. The plot itself was engaging enough, and the aforementioned twists were well done for the most part. I loved seeing the mystery unravel and seeing just how deep this rabbit hole really went, leaving my eagerly anticipating what the answers could be. And it really reminded me a lot of the true crime and that kind of nature of things I watch on YouTube a lot, which was very nice to see. Some were definitely better than others, but during my viewing I was certainly hooked and invested. I also liked the characters, my favourites probably being the unexpected character of Javier, the generous and patient man played very well by Joaquim de Almeida, apologies if I butchered that name, and June herself being a quick-witted and intelligent protagonist without being objectionably unrealistically smart. The performance itself was fine, nothing really to write home about, but I felt that it was good enough for what it was. She was independent and determined to get to the bottom of things, but did actually talk to people around her and the police, and didn't try to be a hero or do stupid things herself in a frustratingly stupid way in order to just move the plot along. That said though, I did feel it was a bit of a stretch in one particular instance, that being the way she immediately drew the connection between her father and Kevin after he name-dropped the prison that he was in. Given that I expected her to be in complete shock thanks to her dead dad suddenly appearing at the door, this moment did kind of jar me a little bit. I feel like overall, what holds this film back from achieving a higher rating is really some of the potentially patchy aspects of the narrative. It didn't really impact me too much while watching it, though certain moments did confuse or stick out to me a bit, like I said, but upon reflection there are some questionable things which at the very least I'd want some answers to. These include: why would the police, knowing that Heather had just been killed by someone in LA, moments before June got there I might add, suspecting that Kevin had help in her abduction, and suspecting that Grace was in fact being kept in LA, not have the house under surveillance 24/7, or at the very least made sure she was never home alone? She was kidnapped from her house and was screaming and making a racket in the process, which anyone staying in the house with her would definitely have heard, and either called the police, potentially get the plate of the car, or even stopping James before he could take her altogether. Secondly, why would the police not have been able to look through the messages on June's phone between her and Grace? I know that it was necessary for the twist reveal, which was a great scene thanks to the music and gravitas, but it seems a bit silly to me that no one looked through those. They'd have played the live feature of the photo with Grace and realised it wasn't her long before June found it herself. Again, I know it's a movie and they did do it pretty well in the way that they did it, but plot holes are plot holes. Thirdly, why didn't they investigate Grace's aliases further, and is there really no way they could have discovered her connection to James? If the police or FBI would have discovered her ex James, he would have immediately been the prime suspect and his home would have been the first place they visited, which is where he was keeping Grace. Surely someone would have found this if they were doing their job. Now, don't get me wrong, I know that sloppy police work, even in cases as or even more serious than this, is certainly a real and sadly fairly common thing, but it still seems quite odd to me that it was done in this movie. It's not like they actually showed any sloppy police work, it just didn't come up at all, which is a different thing. And finally, the plan that James hatched with Kevin is questionable in a lot of ways. Firstly, I'm a little bit lost on how Kevin could guarantee finding Grace on this dating app, and once he did, the gamble that she would take interest in him and even want to do anything to do with him seems unnecessary and very much based on luck. Why wait so long and have them actually build up a relationship instead of luring her to meet somewhere or even just getting her to trust him after a week or two and implementing a plan then? And additionally, why take the risk of the Uber driver scheme? Why not have Kevin simply say he's going to pop to a friend's house to get something or whatever, and then have James or himself incapacitate her and drive the car wherever? There was the risk that Grace would happen to get a look at James's face at any point before getting in, or freaking out and causing a scene anywhere along the way. It just seems very elaborate and relies on a lot of factors outside of their control, rather than being as straightforward and low risk as possible. Now, I'm not one of those people that thinks that just because a character didn't actually take the smartest or most logical choice at any point, it's somehow a flaw with the movie. Obviously not. I can forgive it to an extent because these guys aren't ever made out to be criminal masterminds. You know, James is an unhinged former drug addict who definitely completely loses his shit by the end. But again, it definitely still feels odd, and it did leave me scratching my head a bit. I don't know if I'll come to have more significant issues upon further analysis and seeing what other people's grievances are, but it's definitely not an airtight story. That all being said, it worked well enough that I personally wasn't distracted by these issues in a way that undermined the film. I do wish they did more to develop James's character somewhat and made him a bit more than just an abusive nutter though. I mean, it worked in feeling more grounded, but it was also a bit uncreative compared to the rest of it, and it definitely deflated my excitement a bit overall when the finale of all these twists and turns was just, it's the Crazy Ex. Not terrible or anything, but nothing remotely new or interesting. Missing is no masterpiece across the board, but thanks to its wise centralization around the strongest aspects being the atypical and skillfully slick format and the various twists and turns, it manages, in my view, to conceal its blemishes and highlight its positives, rather like the social media apps it incorporates are so good at doing. It heavily relies upon the style, but the substance is still there, and while it's certainly far from perfect, and the film probably won't be remembered for its plot or characters, they were all still serviceable and made the experience work well enough.